Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.
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 Welcome to the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast with me, Dr. Janine Anderson. Heads up, this show may contain adult language and may mention specific foods. If you find either of those to be too triggering, I trust you to take care of yourself and do what you need to do. This podcast is sponsored by ED Care. ED Care has provided PHP, IOP, and outpatient treatment for all genders 18 and over since 2001. CAMSA, which stands for Connection, Acceptance, Mindfulness, Sense of Self, and Action, is ED Care's mindfulness-based treatment approach and is incorporated into each individualized treatment plan. Facilities are located in Denver, Colorado Springs, and Kansas City, and all treatment is supported by master's level clinicians or higher. ED Care offers 4 specialty tracks for binge eating disorder, elite athletes, substance use, and trauma. And the Connections House, an affordable supportive housing component, adds an extra layer of supervised support. Visit eatingdisorder.care or call 866-771-0861. Grace Filiss received her communication degree from the University of Colorado at Boulder with an emphasis on interpersonal communication and conflict management. She has a strong passion for building authentic relationships to help support and empower all people to get the care they deserve. At ED Care, Grace creates strategic plans for outreach and education, manages and trains outreach members, and builds the bridge between the community and ED Care, which she is most passionate about. She has gained much of her clinical knowledge of eating disorders, including different therapeutic approaches, symptoms, causation, comorbidity, and levels of care when serving as the Director of Operations at La Luna Center. Grace is an advocate for social justice. She served on the Boulder Valley Women's Health Center Board of Directors for 2 years, and in that time co-chaired the Inclusiveness Committee. At ED Care, she continues to advocate for inclusivity in eating disorder treatment and has spearheaded the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. She has also served on the IADEP Denver Metro chapter of the board since 2015. Grace is a Colorado native. In her free time, she enjoys playing golf, cooking, and being a birth doula. You all are going to enjoy hearing from Grace so much. You're about to see she's just one of the most incredible human beings. Grace, welcome. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be a part of this podcast. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, it's an honor to have you. So off the bat, we have to start by saying, by clarifying our relationship in real life or IRL, as the kids say. So people can probably already tell we like each other a lot. We are colleagues. We are close friends. And then also I wanted to just kind of point out that you work for ED Care, which is a sponsor of this podcast. And I wanted to just reassure everybody that this is not going to be an episode-long commercial for ED Care. I obviously like ED Care a lot and appreciate working with them in my practice. I don't work for ED Care. We just share some patients when people need to step up to higher level of care. So if anybody's concerned about this kind of being like a yay, ED Care, it's not. It's going to be so much more general. And then also, of course, you're going to notice the fact that Grace and I really like each other personally and professionally. So it should be a fun episode.
We might have some live entertainment for you is what it sounds like at this point. You can laugh at us or with us or whatever you would like to do in that.
Hopefully with. So
exactly.
To get started, tell us about your background, and then maybe we'll lead into your role at ED Care.
Going way back to college time, I was about to graduate college, and I was going through some depression. I'd lost a close friend, and a lot of things just really seemed to be in transition for me, and I actually made the tough choice to withdraw from school. In that time, I took 4 years off, and in that time, I worked in the golf industry, and I waitressed and that sort of stuff, and I think it actually really helped me get fairly clear on what I wanted to go back and finish up with. And so really what I wanted to pay attention to when I went back into college was a focus on mental health and what was that going to look like for me and how did I want to do it. And I didn't want to just jump in and get my master's right away without really getting a sense for it. So about 2 days before I finished up my degree, I saw a job posting for an office manager at an eating disorder intensive outpatient program in Boulder. And I was like, I think that this is probably the right step for me. I don't know a ton about eating disorders. I just sort of want to see what it's like to work in a group practice and an intensive outpatient program and see what this sort of looks like and learn as much as I can. And little did I know when I applied that it was going to be something that I'm so incredibly passionate about. And, slowly but surely through that process of getting to know eating disorders a bit more, I realized that eating disorders had played, or disordered eating, had played quite a big role in my family going undiagnosed and I think just having some disordered eating struggles throughout my life. So now it's become even more of a bigger passion in that sense and wanting to promote positive body image and work against thin privilege and those pieces of it. I was the director of operations at La Luna Center for about 5 years and then decided to move to Denver and step into my role here at ED Care, and I've been here for about 4. And my role is the coordinator of outreach, and I thought I was going to hate it. I thought I was going to outreach to me was like, oh, what is that? I don't even know what that is. Everyone kept telling me, oh, you're going to be great at it. You can talk to anybody. And I'm like, is that what this is about? Maybe I will like it.
That's why I could never do it.
You're so great at talking to people, though. I mean, that's what you do every day, too.
Like one-on-one.
Yeah, that's true. So, yeah, it's honestly, it's so incredible because it's made me realize what my real passion in life is: connection. Connection means so much to me, and not just in my personal life, but also in my professional life now. And I just love being able to see, I know someone who they would have similar interests, and I can go ahead and introduce them to one another and then watch their incredible connection bloom. That to me is a happy day. And so I just love being able to connect people. And then when you start talking about connecting people for overall support and help of the well-being of the whole world, I mean, I just start getting, you can probably hear it in my voice, really excited and giddy.
Yeah. Well, it's good to have your enthusiasm about it because I think it shows that you really have a passion for people and you've done really great work in getting people who need treatment the resources that they need, and us as professionals, the resources we need to get to those people too. And I also just think that your deep, abiding love for all things Brene Brown is already apparent in this episode. Yeah.
I'm moderately obsessed with her. If she ever asked me to work for her, I would move wherever she would tell me to go.
Brene, if you're listening, Grace, you would make Grace's dreams come true.
Don't tell ED Care. Just kidding.
We know that you're joking, kind of. But so talking about Brene Brown related things, right? Connection, courage, vulnerability. Those are really all of the things that people are going to be experiencing or struggling with when they're thinking about seeking treatment at a higher level of care. And that's really what we're going to kind of focus on this episode. It might be helpful to hear some reasons that people commonly seek treatment at a higher level of care and what that phrase means and everything.
Yeah, I think that when you start talking about where someone is at with their eating disorder, and I think that the big place to really look at a reason for looking at a higher level of care is how much is your eating disorder affecting your functionality of day-to-day life? How intrusive are the thoughts becoming? Is it making it so that you aren't able to show up in your life the way that you want to? And I think that there's real power in being able to notice that you're not showing up how you want to and that you have the courage and wherewithal to show up for yourself and come into treatment. I also think that a big piece of it is paying attention to what your therapist is saying. If you're working with a therapist and they're letting you know, feeling like you're having some struggles that would potentially mean that you need a little bit more support than coming to outpatient care, and what that would potentially look like to step out of your life for a bit or add support, say in an intensive outpatient level of care, to the life that you're already leading. And I think there's some real fear and shame that goes into that piece of it, when in actuality, if you go to the core and the root of someone needing support and reaching out for support, what you really see is this vulnerability and courage and bravery and really owning who they are and wanting to be able to show up more as who they are and separate themselves from their eating disorder.
Yeah, that's a really, really good explanation. On the therapist side of things, I want to clarify, we definitely don't recommend higher level of care to every single person. So if your treatment team is saying that, you really should listen to that and consider the recommendation. We've kind of been tossing around some lingo that some people I'm sure are familiar with, but maybe some people aren't. And full disclaimer here, this is more US specific than it is applicable internationally. So I'm sorry about that. But will you break down what are the different levels of care that people have for eating disorders?
Absolutely. And I also just want to say that if you're looking into a higher level of care treatment, really pay attention to the terms that I'm going to go over. There's even spectrums within those terms. So it starts as at one end being outpatient, where you could potentially be seeing an outpatient therapist or dietitian or psychiatrist, or all of the above, once a week, twice a week. So like even within that piece of outpatient, there's a whole spectrum of how frequently you may be getting that support. So realize at every single step of this spectrum of levels of care that each one of them have their own sort of spectrum within them of the different levels of care. And I'll speak more to that as I continue on talking about the levels of care. So like I said, outpatient would be meeting with a therapist and a dietitian, meeting with a therapist, dietitian, and psychiatrist, and whatever they specify as your needs for how frequently you might see them. The next step up would be something called intensive outpatient. And what that typically looks like is 3 to 4 to 5 days per week of group setting, group therapy, for anywhere from 3 to 5 hours at a time. And like I said, there's a spectrum in that. There's some places that I know of that have done 3 days a week, 3 hours at a time. There's other places that do 4 days a week. It's really just paying attention to the number of hours within each day in that as well. And then the next step up is something called partial hospitalization, or PHP. And that also has its own spectrum in there. So that can look like anywhere from 5 days a week for 5 hours a day to 7 days a week for 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day. So it's really paying attention to what you feel like is going to be the best support for you. And that's the next step, is where we stop talking about specifically days, and it's going to be where you would be in treatment 24 hours. So there's residential and inpatient, and I've heard quite a bit of discussion between the two. Residential treatment seems to feel a bit more homey, but you're going to be receiving treatment in the setting that you're actually staying at. And sometimes the difference between residential and inpatient can just be the length of stay. It can be the medical oversight. It can be, like I said, the facility where you would be staying, if it's more of a homey feel or if it's more of a hospital feel. So paying attention to those two pieces as well. And then the highest level of care would be an ICU hospitalization setting. So does that cover all that you were looking for, Janine? Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that you did a good job, because you acknowledged all of those different things can look really different even within the different levels of care. And every, treatment center does things differently, just like every outpatient provider does things differently. I think it's helpful for people to kind of know what the continuum roughly looks like. I'm curious to hear about your experience with what are some of the common reasons a patient might be seeking higher level of care, or maybe their treatment team is recommending it to them. How would you know if you needed that? Because even when I hear IOP, which intensive outpatient, which is the next step up above outpatient, I have totally had people react like, oh my gosh, 3 times a week for 3 hours? What? Are you kidding me? Of course I can't do that. But those things are there for a reason.
Yeah, I think specifically with intensive outpatient, I actually think that's probably the best way to speak to that is being able to allow yourself to have some support while you're still leading your typical life, whether that means you're in school or you're working a job. It's something that I feel like is fairly typically I have seen offered during the day or also in the evening, more typically in the evening, so that people can still continue on with their lifestyle, but also be able to come in and get support around that, to learn some skills in order to interrupt their behaviors and be able to take a step outside of their eating disorder, work on their values so that they can start paying attention to what really matters to me and separating themselves more from the eating disorder. I think I completely understand and validate that it sounds like a lot, 3 hours a day for 3 days a week. But if you think about that as being self-care to yourself and really trying to take care of yourself and get back to, like I was saying, who you most desire to be, I think that that's just a small glimpse into actually doing some strong self-care.
Yeah. What are some of the concerns that people have brought up with you or your team when they're thinking about entering any kind of higher level of care?
I still think there's a very large stigma, not only with eating disorders, but mental health in general. And this is something I've spoke with several people about at this point, and it's something I believe in strongly. And I think that it's a very simple concept, but that we don't necessarily talk about it. So what I like to bring up is think about your physical body. And if you think about your physical body and you think about that piece of yourself, and would you ever expect to go through your entire life and not have some sort of physical ailment, whether it's spraining an ankle or having a cold or having the flu or anything along those lines? I don't think any of us would ever expect to go through our entire lives without having some sort of physical ailment or feeling not well at some point in time. So why don't we acknowledge the fact that we are not just made up of a physical body, that we also have a mental and emotional side of us, and acknowledge the fact that that's not always going to be performing at its best level, if you want to say that. It's paying attention to the fact that I think it's very rare for anyone to go through life and not have some sort of mental or emotional struggle at some point in time. And why don't we talk about that more? And why don't we make it more okay that we're going to seek help for, if someone was recommending that you need surgery, you would most likely go get surgery. So if someone's recommending that you pay attention to this piece of you that's more of the mental and emotional side of things, why aren't we allowing ourselves to be able to allow that part of us to be taken care of? Does that make sense?
I love that. Yeah, I think that that's a great analogy. And what was popping up in my head too is what you spoke to earlier about that it's so common for people to feel really ashamed when they need to seek more treatment and get more support for any mental health or eating disorder related concern. And that's not how we feel about physical health things. With your surgery example, like I've had to have my gallbladder removed years ago, and I didn't feel ashamed that I was having my gallbladder out. It was inconvenient and stuff, but I wasn't like, oh man, I feel really guilty and bad about myself and I don't want to tell. I never had those thoughts. I was just like, yep, it's got to happen.
Right. And I think, how can we fight this? How can we get to a place of being able to celebrate when someone's going to get treatment for a mental health or emotional struggle? I think we need to get to a place where we're celebrating it. I don't know if that's exactly what everyone would feel, but being able to, show some support and compassion and feel empowered in the fact that we're being able to take our own overall health, whether it's mental or physical, and do what we want with that. And I think that's just what's been a real struggle for me, and what I feel like I continuously get on my soapbox about a bit is we're all going to have some mental, emotional struggles in our lives. And why can't we all sort of band together and support each other in that and build each other up? I think that community piece of it and connection piece of it is huge in helping people feel even better about who they are and who they show up as.
Right. To know that you're not alone, and to know that even if somebody in your life hasn't experienced that same thing firsthand, that I'm always hesitant to say are proud of you, but are proud of you for taking care of yourself, or they support you in your effort to take care of yourself, even if that means that you're going to be spending a chunk of time working on this and taking a lot of self-care time. I think that would really shift things. You mentioned stigma of seeking treatment. What do you think contributes to the stigma of seeking treatment at a higher level of care for eating disorders?
I think there's a lot of fear and shame around needing the support that would be offered at a higher level of care. I think that is fed into, and this, what's coming to mind for me right now is how almost bizarre it feels, this dichotomy in our culture. So let me go into this a bit more so that hopefully you can understand where my head's at with this.
Mm-hmm.
I think that society makes us feel like when we're doing things to take care of ourselves, such as coming to treatment, that there's something A, wrong with us, and B, that we're doing something very selfish in taking care of ourselves.
Mm-hmm, like it's seen as an indulgence. And anyone who's ever been to eating disorder treatment would tell you it's not indulgent. It's not a spa day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think there's that piece of it, and then you flip that, and there's this social media piece that is actually very self-involved. So I see like sort of a little bit of a battle between those two pieces, if that makes sense, of here's this feeling of me taking care of myself is not helping to take care of other people. But then we have this whole society and culture that's sort of feeding off of, for lack of a better word, our sort of self-involvedness. And so how do we make our self-involvedness be something positive? And I think the way to do that is really to help empower people to get whatever sort of help and support they need. I mean, side note, total soapbox moment. I think everyone should be in therapy. I just think everyone should be in therapy just because I think it helps you understand yourself better, and I think you can get more out of life. And so I think that once you start paying attention to yourself and giving yourself the things that you need and the support and love and bravery and courage that you need to show up as who you are, then what actually starts happening is it's this ripple effect into the rest of your life and the rest of the people that you touch, even to the point of acquaintances. I think it can really be this ripple effect. I mean, they talk about this quite a bit in parenting, and I'm not a parent. I'll just get that out there right now. But really speaking to the fact that what has to happen is, in order to be the best parent you can be, you have to be taking care of yourself and then be able to take care of your child. Like the example of being on an airplane and the oxygen mask, you're supposed to put it on yourself before you put it on another person. Mm-hmm. So if you put it on yourself and you're taking care of yourself, then you're able to help the person next to you, and there's that ripple effect. And I think if we were all able to dip in and spend some time taking care of ourselves, getting in touch with who we are, that's going to be a ripple effect out to the rest of the world. And I know I sound like I'm skipping in a field of sunflowers and butterflies are flying, but that's like my real hope. And I would love to see the world be in a more empowered place, an authentic place.
Yeah, me too. And I honestly don't really understand the stark contrast that you spoke to about the difference between how we generally think of our physical health and getting treatment for it versus anything that's more on the mental health side. And that it just really gets in the way of people just getting treatment. And what we know from the research is that the earlier you get treatment and doing adequate treatment, like amount of treatment, frequency of treatment, ultimately leads to better outcomes. So this stigma that gets in the way and the fear of seeking treatment can actually interfere with people's progress in very, very significant and unfortunately life-threatening ways sometimes. So I don't get why that's there either. I also think everyone should be in therapy.
Yay, you're with me.
Like at least at some point in your life, you should just go. It's such a great investment in yourself. And I feel like people who've never experienced anxiety or depression seem to be more of the exception than the rule now. So those are really valid reasons to go get help as well. I also wanted to touch on what are some of the concerns that come up for patients who are considering higher level of care that make it harder because of issues related to representation, inclusivity, health at every size, because I feel like that is something that we need to pay more attention to, and there's a lot more work to be done.
Absolutely. For a long time, I think the cultural belief was that eating disorders don't affect everyone, that they affect this small population of people, tendency to be females who are white or Caucasian and upper middle class. And really, there's even research showing at this point it affects everyone. It affects any socioeconomic status, any body size, any race, any gender. And I think that, unfortunately, eating disorders don't have any bias. They have a tendency to hit anyone who may be needing some sort of coping mechanism that may not be super helpful for most of the time. I think that a big piece of what we need to pay attention to is how can everyone get some sort of support? And I mean everyone. So how can everyone have access to the treatment and care that they need? And I think really paying attention to, if you're looking at higher level of care treatment, actually, let me take that back. If you're looking at any sort of therapy, I highly recommend doing your research and making sure that the person that you're going to be working with is going to make you feel safe and comfortable just as you are. And I think asking the right questions when you're exploring that is a big piece to make sure that that person's making you feel comfortable and that you can just show up as you are. I think there's a lot of work to be done on this. That's probably why you hear some hesitation in my voice. And I'm just really hoping that we're moving in a good direction with this. I think that health at every size, you should absolutely be looking into and making sure that the providers that you're working with are paying attention to that piece of it. I'm a strong believer in health at every size. I'm a strong believer in that an eating disorder treatment facility should not be paying attention to your weight, and really making sure that that's in line with the values that you're walking into treatment with and not your eating disorders values that you're walking in for treatment for.
Right. That's a good segue into, we wanted to discuss what are some questions that if you are looking into treatment, specifically at a higher level of care, that you could ask of the treatment center. I'm sure some of these will generalize over to outpatient too, or any kind of care. But what are some considerations or concerns that people might ask about?
I think to start off, you could really think about, what are you wanting to get out of treatment? Are you wanting to be, the best probably example that I can give is making some choices about college. And I'm recognizing that there's privilege just within that with me saying this, but I'm hoping that this metaphor can potentially land. So a lot of times, I think the first piece of how to be sort of weighing the pros and cons of different treatment facilities is it going to be sort of a larger setting, a larger number of clients, like say a large university would be, or is it going to be more of the feeling of a small liberal arts school? And what is the feel that you want? And really paying attention to what feels right to you in that, and sort of navigating it from there. So that can be paying attention to the number of clients that might be in program and asking how many people are typically going to be participating in the groups. What are the size of the groups? Do the size of the groups vary? Do I get any sort of one-on-one time with a therapist or any of the treatment team? And then that leads into talking about, what does your treatment team look like? I strongly believe that a multiple disciplinary team is essential. So what that means is having an individual therapist, a family therapist, a psychiatrist, a dietitian. Maybe there's someone who is overseeing medical as well, an internal medicine doctor or a physician's assistant. I think having all of those sort of components to work on a treatment team together when appropriate is hugely essential, because you get to work on all of those different pieces on an individual basis then, as well as getting the support of group therapy. I think another piece to also really consider that's of high importance is the insurance piece, and paying attention to, is this something that is going to drastically affect my quality of life from a financial standpoint? And I think the beauty that I have seen in working in different treatment facilities is that when you call in and start asking questions about insurance and wanting to sort of find out if this is going to be something that you will be able to do, you start realizing that most of the people who are working at these treatment facilities are actually wanting to be advocates and help you out as much as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. And that can be really helpful. So a lot of times you could be going through the process and you may not even have to deal with the insurance piece of it. Someone might be dealing with it at the treatment facility for you. So that takes some pressure off of your shoulders of you not having to deal specifically with your insurance. I also think that there's a lot of treatment facilities that allow for talking through payment plans and being able to work through that. So I want to acknowledge that I understand that there's financial pressure within going to treatment, but also that there's typically access to, depending on your insurance and depending on if you don't have insurance, there's typically ways that treatment programs really still want to be able to help you and also not cause more harm to your lifestyle. I think another piece to pay attention to is the modalities of treatment and the different types of groups that would be happening within the treatment facility. So are you someone who has really wanted to pay attention to your values? I would look for a program that might have some groups around acceptance and commitment therapy. Just looking at the specific pieces that may be a good fit for you in particular. I do want to say that I feel like a lot of treatment programs at this point in time are using the word individualized, and I would highly recommend calling and asking exactly what that means and making sure that it feels as individualized as you want it to feel. And I think that the more individualized we can possibly make treatment, the better off the person's outcome is. This is probably the most important piece of considering going to a higher level of care. And I'm jumping back on a soapbox again.
Do it.
But I think the most important part of seeking treatment is being your own advocate and making sure that you play just as active of a role on the treatment team as every other aspect on the treatment team. I think the person who's coming in really needs to be able to show up in the role of being the most important player on that team, being able to ask for what you need, being able to say, I don't feel like this is working for me. Can we try something different? Being able to say, I'm really struggling today and I just need someone with me. I mean, I think it's just those little pieces of assertiveness that may be a good piece to being that active role on the treatment team. And I think that a lot of times when you're stepping into treatment, it doesn't feel like you have a role on the treatment team. It feels like the treatment team may be talking at you. And I think that we need to switch that dynamic and change it up and make it more of you have just as important and active of a role on your treatment team as every other person on your treatment team. So that's my soapbox on that. Just to say a touch more on that. Sorry, I'm going all in.
No, go for it.
I think that everyone needs to pay attention to if you're getting recommended for a higher level of care treatment or if you feel like that's something that you need, don't do it for anybody else but you. I think that's probably the most important piece to take away is this needs to be about you and no one else. And even if that just means you have just a glimmer of that hope and that glimmer of that empowerment, that's okay. We at treatment facilities can help you increase that, but just come and do this for yourself. Don't do it for anybody else.
Yeah, and specifically and I want to acknowledge that I know people feel different kinds of pressure and there are limitations and that can be connected to privilege too, but to really feel like you have an active role in picking where you're going and what kind of treatment you want to do and not letting somebody else's opinion, like in your family, for example, maybe be the ultimate deciding factor, that your opinion is just as, if not more important in that as well. And I love what you said about assertive communication. As we know from previous episodes of the podcast, that's what Anita Johnston identifies as one of the 2 essential skills for eating disorder recovery: emotional literacy and assertive communication. If you haven't listened to that episode, go back and refresh. So I think that that's also just so essential and so helpful. And that's a skill from doing any kind of treatment that is going to be helpful everywhere for the rest of your life. Once you feel more comfortable with assertive communication, you get to have that gift and take it with you going forward.
Absolutely.
I wanted to hear about what things have you seen, having worked in this setting for so long, in terms of what happens to people when they go through treatment and they are really working hard on their recovery and they're recovering, in terms of what happens with authenticity, connection, capacity for vulnerability.
Yeah, wow. I feel like this is a really big question. And it warms my heart to think about the things that I have absolutely seen come out of people's work here. And I really feel like probably the biggest thing I've seen, and I feel like I've already said it so much in this, is people really getting in touch with and coming to terms with who they really are. And the biggest piece, showing up as who they actually are. When they're able to let go of their eating disorder and able to step into who they actually are at their core and be vulnerable. And I mean, Brene Brown says it best with vulnerability is you showing up and showing who you really are. And so I think that we get to see that so frequently here, of so many different strengths of people show up that they never actually knew were in them. Things like being able to speak for themselves in a way that they've maybe never spoken for themselves before, whether that's even just within their family or whether that's to the world, and show up as the person that they've always intended to be, that they've always known is in there. But there's been some things and some thoughts that have been holding them back from being able to show up that way. And the eating disorder is absolutely that piece that stands in the way of them really showing up. I think another thing is it's continuously that we see, just like we were speaking to, the assertiveness piece. I think by showing up and being vulnerable and being brave and being courageous enough to be able to even come to treatment helps people become a bit more assertive about the things that they need. And with vulnerability and courage and bravery showing up, the fear and shame of the struggle has a tendency to go down quite a bit, if not completely diminish. And so then they're able to really show up as advocates for eating disorders. The number of times that I have seen people so comfortable to speak out and share their story after treatment, and I think that is priceless to be able to share with the world. And I think that there's just such beauty in every single person's story, and that's probably goes back to me talking about wanting to make sure that you find somewhere that pays attention really to the individualized plan for you, because you're here seeking treatment for yourself. And I think we really need to pay attention to those things that make you authentically you, and what is going to get you there and going to help you with that. And I think that sharing our stories really help us get to a point of feeling like there's connection again. And we know that eating disorders do not thrive when there is connection, which is so incredible. So the more that we can build that connection, but also realizing that every single person's story is so different and so beautiful in its own way. And I think that I've gotten to hear a lot of stories throughout the years that I've worked in this, and it just really is so incredibly heartwarming. And I just feel like if I could, and if we all could, rid the world of eating disorders, I know that we would. But until we can get to that point, let's offer really supportive, compassionate care that works for each individual person.
With all of your identities. Nobody has to change any of those or should have to change any of those when they go to treatment.
No, show up as you are.
Yes.
Absolutely. Show up as you are and make sure that treatment facility honors who you are.
Yeah, especially in terms of health at every size and making sure that you're going to receive weight neutral care at minimum, because I think that that's another piece that our field needs to work on and has a long way to go with, is that nobody should feel bad about being in a larger body and seeking treatment for an eating disorder. And that's a whole nother layer of stigma that gets in the way of people getting the care that they need. And that always breaks my heart. And I understand why people feel that way, because it's rooted in some reality, and that's unfortunate.
Absolutely. And I think it goes back to, the episode that you have Carmen Cool on. I think if anybody hasn't listened to that piece of it, to go back and listen to her speak on health at every size and thin privilege and weight oppression. I definitely think that's a fantastic episode to really dip into that piece.
Yeah, Carmen's amazing. Shout out to Carmen. In kind of wrapping up today, what makes you hopeful about patients' futures and the future of the field? Because despite being so deep in the industry, you always have like such genuine passion and compassion and hope as your outlook on things going forward.
I would say probably what makes me hopeful is, this sounds sort of nerdy and not typically I'm not typically scientific, but I'm going to say research. I mean that in the sense of, I think that there are a lot of people committed to trying to understand causation and being able to try to pay attention to eliminating eating disorders through paying attention to causation, whether it is looking at brain images or whether it's paying attention to family systems, genetics, any of those pieces. I think that that's probably what makes me feel hopeful. And what I think is really exceptional is that eating disorders have been around for a long time, but the research of eating disorders hasn't been around for a long time. And so if you think about how far we have come in a short amount of time in the research that we have done and things that we have put into place in order to help support someone struggling with an eating disorder, I think that we really need to celebrate how far we've come and also be really excited about, okay, if we've come this far in this short amount of time, where can we go from here? And there's just continuously more and more and more research happening. I feel like, luckily, let's continue with that and hopefully get to a place of being able to end eating disorders and being able to live in a world where there isn't diet culture, there isn't fat shaming. And I think what makes me the most helpful and drives me forward in that is I love to go out and raise awareness. And if I can go and speak to a doctor's office, say, and feel like someone, even one person in that room, has walked away and thought, okay, so everything that I believed before may not be how it is, and I want to explore this a bit more, that makes me excited. Because I think we have a lot of awareness that needs to happen and education that needs to happen in our general culture in order to not only help with eliminating eating disorders, but also help with making us an overall more successful culture.
Yeah, and that really not just ending eating disorders, but as you said, ending diet culture and making sure that nobody and nobody feels oppressed for any reason. Nothing would thrill me more than to actually be out of a job at some point because this all ended. But
absolutely.
Grace, thank you so much for sharing all that you've shared today. Thank you for your knowledge and your expertise and for your heart. I adore you. Tell us about where people can connect with you and or ED Care if they want to, and following up from this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. So I try to really set myself up as a resource center just within me, and I love to be able to bridge people to any sort of support that they need. So feel free to reach out to me. Probably the easiest way to get in touch with me is via email. And my email address is G as in Grace, S as in Frank, ILISS as in Sam, at eatingdisorder.care. You can also find ED Care at www.eatingdisorder.care. You can find me on Facebook. You can find ED Care on Facebook. We're on all of the social networks, but please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to talk with anybody and consult with them if they're trying to figure out where might be a good place for them to go for treatment, if they have specific ideas in mind of the support that they need, even just to talk about stigma and trying to get comfortable with the idea of treatment. I'd be happy to be a support and an advocate for anybody who would like that support.
Thank you so much. I will put all of that info, including your email address, in the show notes. So if anybody is looking for that, it will be there for you. Grace, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It was delightful to finally have you.
Much.
Oh my gosh. Yay.
Yeah, it's so great. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks for joining me for another episode. Let's keep in touch. You can find all the information you need about the podcast at eatingdisorderrecoverypodcast.com, including full podcast episodes and links to all of our social media sites. You can join our Facebook group for the podcast by searching Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast on Facebook. This is a closed group for listeners of the podcast looking to connect, share resources, and get involved in a pro-recovery community. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or YouTube. Please leave us a review and let us know how we're doing. Talk to you next time on the Eating Disorder Recovery Podcast.